Hello and welcome to this London Embroidery School Stitch Along. I'm going to be your host for today, Natasha, and I wanted to do something a little bit different from our usual Stitch Alongs today because when I did this design over here, which some of you regulars may recognise, I put up a reel about window mounting it so that you can embroider directly onto a garment, particularly if it's of a slightly odd shape like this curved collar. And it got an awful lot of interest because people were really curious about the whole window mounting, going directly onto garments, etc., etc. So I thought today, when I was working on the other side of the collar, I would do that live with you so that you could see the setup process more so than the embroidery itself, because obviously that's something that people are really curious about. Oh, sorry there. So this is because we have the second of the meadow flower designs coming out at the end of this week, which is going to be the Tansy design, which is this one here. Very pretty, very summery and nice and colourful with the yellow. So over this side, I'm going to start by talking about how to transfer your design. Now, obviously, you can just grab a pen and I would highly recommend a heat transferable pen a heat erasable pen. So if you make any mistakes or anything that's visible afterwards, you can just get rid of it. But yeah, you can just draw straight on. Equally, another method is if you have an iPad, which some of you may be working with, then you can just bring up your design, lay your section over the top, a little bit like so, just so you can see what's going on underneath, and then begin to draw straight through. That also works pretty well if you're working on a window, which is the last method that you can use if you don't have an iPad. Now, you can do this with a window, as I say, or you can do it if you've got like a little flat light like this one, which is going to make things probably a little weird for your viewing a minute. But now you would usually do this with paper, just placing your design over the top, place your garment on, and then you can draw through. But it works equally well with an existing piece of embroidery. One thing to think about when you are working straight onto a garment, particularly with a design like this, is, think about the placement and what's going to be complementary to the garment itself. So because we've got this little sprig design, I'm trying to put the kind of joining point of the sprig down into the bottom of this corner so that it sort of just gives it a little bit of grounding, gives it somewhere to go. And one of my top tips would be that if you are going straight onto a garment like this, don't try and drag the pen across, because it's just going to buckle up the fabric and it just doesn't work, basically. If you do a series of small, close together dots, you will just as easily be able to see your lines. They're easier to cover with the embroidery if you were working, say, just in pencil and, not a heat erasable pen. And then you know that you can easily cover over what you've done with your embroidery. And it's up to you kind of how much detail you feel you need to add to be able to do what you need to do. Some people like to add a lot of detail in with their drafting. I prefer just to go quite lightly and fill it in with the embroidery. So I'm just going to get some of these leaves in here. And then we'll just put a little sprig on this one just to finish it off, because things always look nice in threes. So that's probably enough detail for me. I'm going to make a small adjustment so that we can then frame this up. Oh. Everyone okay there? So we've got our embroidery frame here. And you will see that I already have a window cut out of this fabric. The fabric is quite a heavy calico, and you can see that I've used this many times before, which is one of the lovely things that you can do with a nice heavy calico that's going to hold up well. Equally, you can kind of cut multiple bits out of the same piece of fabric, different size holes for different window uses. You always kind of want to have the smallest window you can for the size of job that you're doing. So you don't want to have a massive window for a tiny embroidery, because it will give you less tension on your fabric, which you want good tension. Well, as good as possible. The thing with window mounting is it's never going to be quite as secure as if you were embroidering onto a fully framed up piece. So do bear that in mind, but it is a really useful tool and solution for, you know, items where you couldn't frame it up, either because they're too delicate. Sometimes this is a good option, you know, if you're working on like a silk hanky or something like that. It might be that you are finding that it's too awkward a shape, like with this collar. You know, it's on a curve. You'd need such a tiny embroidery hoop, and you wouldn't be able to get close to the edges either. That's one of the things that this really allows you to kind of like get into everywhere. Grab yourself some pins. And initially, we just want to make sure that the embroidery is going to fully sit into the window so that we can embroider through the hole in the window, and therefore not have any backing on our embroidery. So I'm just going to try and make sure that this collar seam here is straight and get that secure. We're just going to initially pin everything into place like we would so often do, and then we're going to tack everything into place so that we can add as many stitches as we want to get it as secure as it can be, and then we can embroider away and remove all the tacking stitches afterwards, and we should be golden. If anyone has any questions whilst I'm working on this, please do feel free to pop some comments into the comments box at the bottom. I will mostly be looking at my stitching, but I will try and check in on the comments periodically just to make sure I haven't missed anything. So feel free to have a chat to me. It doesn't necessarily even need to be a question. It can just be if you fancy saying something. I'd love to hear from you. So there we go. And you can see we've got this flappy section, but we're going to deal with that in a minute. So don't worry about it. I have just threaded up some embroidery thread. Mine does just happen to be embroidery thread, but it could just be any sewing thread. It's absolutely fine for this. You can just anchor that with a little knot in the back. Just do a couple of anchoring stitches to get yourself going. And then go around and tack the edges to get this held into place. So as I mentioned, this design will be coming out for sale to our VIPs on Thursday the 10th. VIPs are anyone who's on the mailing list. So if you are enjoying this sort of content and you would like us to share tips and tricks and exclusive offers and such like to your email directly, delivered direct to you, then please do think about joining the mailing list. You will find prompts for that on our website or at the bottom of the homepage. Equally, it's in the link in our bios on Instagram if you want to go direct. It will be coming out to the public on Friday, if it hasn't already sold out to the VIPs by then. So do look out for that. I will be launching it in the afternoon. And as I mentioned, this is the second of the 3 meadow flower designs. The Achillea one came out earlier this year, and oh, it's just so pretty. And I really love it on this shirt colour. I now wear this shirt more than I did when it was plain. So, you know, that's the sign that you made a good choice with your embroidery. Right, let's remove the pins that we no longer need. So in through this section, we just want to start to make a series of stitches that are just going to pull the collar out to put it into tension. You don't have to be too careful with your tacking stitches. You want the tension to be consistent, that is important, but you know, the spacing and the kind of tidiness of the stitches, it's sort of irrelevant, to be honest. As long as they do the job, they do the job, you know what I mean? If it's looking a bit baggy, then you need to add some more stitches. Then you know that, you know, you're not adding enough, and that is important. But you can see, because it's got this sort of ladder effect, it does pull it out and over to the side, and you can see how quickly that flattens off to become a normal fabric tension to embroider onto. Right, I'm going to get myself... You can go back and like adjust the tension as well. Don't be afraid to work that a little bit. I'm going to get myself a new piece of thread. This is getting a bit short. Using my favourite method of threading up, which is the bloom into the eye method. There are more than one way, well, there is more than one way to thread a needle, but you already knew that. If you didn't, then do check out some of our pro tips, one of which is all about 4 different ways to thread up the needle. Those are my personal 4 favourites, but my absolute favourite is the thread into the eye method. I just think it's so versatile. Doesn't really matter what thread you're using, it does the job. What is going on here? There we go. Just working our way along. Quite thread thirsty doing this, understandably, because there's a lot of thread just sort of sitting here. I mean, I say sitting here like that, like it's not doing anything. It's doing a great job. You can see how much it's pulled it into tension, which is exactly what we wanted it to do. So, you know, it's doing its prime purpose there. And then we can just come back and again knot off when we're ready. All of this is going to get removed when we're done, so again, I don't really worry about the knots or anything like that. It's the fact they're visible, because they're going to be taken away in the end. Okay, there we go. enough tension to be getting on with. And so now we can just move on to our embroidery itself. So I'm going to grab some of the lighter green that we have. I always like to work with a fingertip to elbow length piece of thread. I think I'm going to go with 2 strands today. Just splitting that embroidery thread, working with the twist, and that stops your embroidery thread from getting all twisted up. Little quick knot into the end. Stab stitches to begin. And then we can work into or drop into the pattern of our outline stitch. So the first one goes in and we come back up halfway along to put in the first half a stitch. Then we go half a stitch forwards and come back on ourselves to meet the middle of the previous stitch. Then we go out and back to the middle on the left hand side of the previous stitch, so that we end up with a stitch that looks like it's leaning over to the right. This creates a lovely twist to it. It creates a sort of like rope-like effect that is most complementary to the way that the thread is twisted when it is created. You can go right downwards slanting, but kind of from the left upwards to the right slanting is more flattering, in my opinion. You may also notice that I am stitching with both hands. The right hand, because I'm right-handed, stays on the underneath side of the embroidery hoop. So I never really see its workings, but because it's my dominant hand, I trust that it is more accurate than my left hand, being my non-dominant hand. And so my non-dominant hand gets the assistance of my eyes, as with the dominant hand has to stand on its own, so to speak. If you'd like to know more about stitching with both hands, again, we've got another pro tip on our YouTube channel all about that one. Our YouTube channel is a great resource for free content, loads of information on there, particularly the pro tips section, because we share lots of tips and tricks of things that we as professional embroiderers stitching every day, what we do to, make our stitching process smoother, more streamlined, releasing those pain points. Sometimes that's how you can increase the speed of your stitching, of which stitching with both hands is a method of that, just as an idea. It may just be a really small tweak, like how to make a quick knot, which, if you're doing a small embroidery, may not seem like a big deal at all. But if you're trying out something more challenging, you may create 100 knots in a piece, just of different pieces of thread that you've worked with. And so in doing so, if you could have a really fast and easy way of making a knot, would that not make your life easier, your hobby that bit more enjoyable? Anyway, there's lots of content on there that's, hopefully going to help level up your embroidery that little bit more. Show you something you don't know, basically. Because we're all learning all the time, aren't we? People often confuse outline stitch with stem stitch, and on the surface they can look quite similar. both being a sort of rope-like effect. However, the big difference is the order in which you form the stitch. So with stem stitch, each stitch stems from within the previous stitch. So if we were to do a stem stitch, we would come up inside of the previous stitch here and then reach forwards, like so. So we stem from inside the previous stitch and reach forwards. However, if we were to do an outline stitch, we'll make a new line. We've just got to put in the extra half. The little halves at the end don't count. Then you go out along the line first and then go back into the previous stitch. So out along the line and back to the previous stitch. And so that's how I remember the difference between the two. That stem stitch stems from within the previous stitch, as with outline stitch goes out and then comes back on itself in order to form the stitch. Just getting towards the end of this first piece of thread. When you're working with a fingertip to elbow length piece, it's a really good workable length that you shouldn't get too tangled up. If your thread is too long, then you are going to tangle your thread an awful lot, and that can get very frustrating and become one of those pain points that I mentioned earlier. With embroidery, it's something that people often find challenging and annoying, that they're just like either wasting loads of thread because they just have to cut it out, or they're spending loads of their precious hobby time undoing knots, which was not what you came for. You came to actually, do the embroidery. So if you keep it to that shorter length, then you should have much, much better control of the thread, and you shouldn't get caught up so often. It does, however, mean that particularly when you're working in outline stitch, because it is quite a thread thirsty technique, then you will go through more thread than you would do otherwise, or might anticipate going through. So splitting the threads, I like to just separate the top pieces from one another and then put my finger in between and allow it to untwist itself, which means that, again, it doesn't get tangled. It just untwists down to the bottom, and you can easily put the rest of the thread to one side to be used. There's no knots or tangles to worry about. And you can thread up the threads that you have selected and get started. Once again, I'm just leaving my thread over here to finish later. Same with the knots, because we're doing anchoring stitches, we can cut those off after. We just want to make sure that we're anchoring the threads somewhere that they will get covered over. Now, as I mentioned earlier, with outline and stem stitch, each stitch leans on the previous stitch and the next stitch to be stitched to create that twisting effect, which means at the end of each line, both ends, you need to add a little half stitch in order to complete the twist. Because if this was the end of our line, you can see it gets a bit stringy, but it also kind of loses its angle because it's depending on the next stitch, which as a full stitch isn't going to happen, to lean on. But if we just put in a little half coming up at the end of that stitch and then going back down into the middle of the previous one, then that evens out the thickness of the whole of that line and completes the pattern to give it that finished look. So when we start a new line, we go in with our first length of stitch and then come up in the middle of it to put in the first half that goes down at the end of the first stitch so that it is the correct thickness, and going forwards half a stitch length and back into the previous stitch. And when I say into, I don't mean to split, because then that would be split stitch, but into in terms of like visually, just so that it's leaning against it and you get that pattern. Not forgetting at the end of the line to come in half a stitch to just push it back into place, and then it's all nicely balanced. Now, something you guys might actually be able to help me with, in fact, and I did want to ask you guys about today, because you're often very knowledgeable on these things, is if there are any other small business owners out there who have had the same issues as we have with the GPSR EU compliance stuff. We are trying desperately to be able to ship to the EU again. We've not been able to the whole of this year, and it's been really upsetting, and we want to get back on that, but we just want to find a way to sort that out. So if anyone knows how they sorted it for themselves, or knows how someone else, another small business, managed to get themselves going again and able to ship to the EU without it being this like huge problem, please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. And, this community always surprises us with how engaged and interesting and interested you guys are. So we'd love if you could help, if you have any knowledge on this, because funnily enough, we are not, business lawyers, and we don't want to get ourselves into any trouble, obviously, which is why we just had to kind of like stop shipping to the EU altogether. But just know, those of you who are in the EU, if anyone is currently listening from one of the EU countries that we can't ship to, we are really cut up about it. We're really sorry, and we are desperately working on a solution. Any updates on that, and I will be the first to let you guys know, because it's just madness, really. Anyways, short shout out there for a little assistance. Back to usual content resumption. Now, I think I'm going to move on, just whilst I'm live, onto a different technique for you. Once I come to the end of this thread, which will be in a hot minute. These kits, I think, are absolutely fab for taking away with you. If you are planning a summer holiday and something to do whilst you're lounging to keep those idle hands busy, and make the most of your precious time off to do something lovely, then I think these kits are great for this sort of thing. They don't have a lot of bits, which is something you want to avoid if you want to take your kit away with you, particularly if you're like, I don't know, going to be around a pool or something, and there might be little kids and that. I would not suggest like beading or gold work is a good idea to take to like a poolside or a beach or wherever you are having your holiday, just because there's lots of individual little parts. But kits like this are fab for that, because there's just 3 colours of thread. You get a booklet with all your instructions. You don't need to be on your phone. You can use it as some time away from screens, relax those eyes a little bit, create something really pretty. They may well be techniques that you've used before. They may be techniques that you have not tried before, and you can learn it whilst creating something beautiful. we go. Let's leave that to one side. Fab. Okay, we're going to move on to a new colour. So I'm going to grab my yellow. Again, I'm going to go with a fingertip to elbow length piece of thread. For this, I like to have 3 strands. So just splitting that whole skein in half. Again, running the finger down, allowing the thread to twist freely. Just using that thumb to control it a little bit. Making sure there's no wastage. Allowing those 3 strands to bloom into the eye of that needle. This is why it's so great, because you could just control all the strands all at once, and you can get it into, you know, what is really quite a small-eyed needle. This is a size 10 embroidery needle that I'm working with today. Again, my favourite needle. I only use my favourite things, it would clearly seem. But they're my favourite because they do a great job. So again, just some little stab stitches to start. I saw, comment there, sorry. Deep Violet Clouds, have you asked Holly for advice on this? She's always trying to help small female owned businesses. That's a really good shout. Thank you. I will have a little look at that after we're done here. That's an amazing suggestion, actually. You're right. That is a resource I have not as yet tapped. Okay, so coming up for our first French knots, we wrap around the needle. We drop the needle down where we want the stitch to finish, controlling the thread with the opposite hand. We ease that through the fabric and a little knot is formed. Come up again, wrap, drop the needle down almost on the same spot. Pop it through, control the thread as it travels through the fabric. The more random you are with your positioning of your French knots, the better they will look. You can also kind of experiment a little bit with using a single wrap and a double wrap for different densities. So this one will just be a little single wrap. The ever so slightly smaller, but it will just create a little bit of interest between the two as you work your way around the design, just filling in the area. And you can kind of just, you know, let your brain relax, let your mind wander whilst your hands are busy. Wrap, drop it down, pop it through. Sometimes I just like to listen to the thread going through the fabric. And falling into that rhythm. Really just, you know, ticks those little boxes in your brain. Hopefully it makes you as happy as it does me. Wrap. Drop it down. The Sewing Society says lovely. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Always nice to have you on with us. Hope you're well. And so you can see how you would continue, and you can just go as sporadically as you like with French knots because they're detached stitches. You know, they're really great just to build up by eye, and you can add as many or as kind of as few as you want. And if there's somewhere that you think looks a bit bare, then throw a few more in. You know, you've got a bit more of a creative license, particularly as presumably with this design, you will have made the kit once already. So you'll be familiar with the artwork. And then if you want to do like I'm doing and apply all the things that you've learned to a real life outcome like a garment, then, you know, you've got that little bit more creative license, but you've also built up a bit of confidence having done it once before already to know how the outcome should look, what it's going to look like when it's done. And so you can have a bit more of a play yourself. Right, I'm just going to pop that to one side. I'm going to grab myself a fresh needle. And let's go on to our dark green thread. Oh, where are we? Where's the end? There we go. Okay, so I'm going to take a single strand of this to start with. Now, we put a poll out, was it last week? I think so. Where we talked about what are the stitches that you know, sigh when you see on a kit or that you need to use because you don't enjoy doing them. And so one thing that did come up quite a lot of times, actually a few times, was French knots. And hopefully maybe we have dispelled some of the issues that you might face with French knots if you were one of the people that said that French knots were a problem to you. But the one that came up most frequently was satin stitch, which is what we're going to use for this little sprig of leaves down the bottom here. And so a few of the thoughts that I had about that was to those people, if any of you are watching, or if you are just someone who also struggles with satin stitch, is, are you using a split stitch underneath? I would strongly suggest that you do, just to kind of like get the outline going. Create yourself a hard edge that your stitches can lean against when you come to adding the satin stitches in on top. So that's all I'm doing at the moment, is just coming in to each stitch, splitting the previous one. Just to get a nice solid line. So we come up in the middle of the previous stitch, split the strand, and this is why we're only using one strand for this, because we want to make sure that we are actually splitting the strand and not just going in between multiple strands, because that would defeat the point. Come up and through. And that splitting of the half a stitch before means that you can, you know, create smooth curves from little straight stitches. Now, I would suggest that you go on and do all of the split stitches for that before you move on, but for the purposes of today I'm going to move on. I'm going to be using 2 strands for the satin stitch, just for speed, to be honest. Once again, little quick knot into the end, drop that down on the outside, stab stitches into the middle of the leaf because that's going to get covered over. And then starting in the middle, I'm going to angle my stitches. Again, bottom left to top right along the length of the leaf, just to set up a nice angle. Sorry, I'm going to get rid of these knots because they're a bit distracting right now. With satin stitch, you always start in the middle so that you can set up your angle, whether that be for a continuous angle or for a turning angle. It's also important that you always go one side to the other in a continuous direction. So I'm going from the left hand side of this leaf to the right, always up on the left and then down on the right. Again, this is a more thread thirsty way of filling the stitch than going left to right, right to left, left to right, right to left. But it does mean that, you know, your tension is superior. The balance of the stitching is much better. It just creates for so much more of a tidy outcome. And because we've got that split stitch around the edge, it's very clear where each of the stitches needs to be placed. It just always needs to buffer right up next to that split stitch edge. The split stitch allows a little something for it to go around and creates a really smooth satin stitch. When you've come to the end of your shape, you then go back to the middle, again coming up on the left, down on the right. To get that satiny finish. Just narrowing up to the end. A little bit like so. That's all I really wanted to cover with you guys for today. I'm just going to check I haven't missed anything. I don't think I have. No. So yeah, that's all the stitches that are included in the Tansy kit coming out later this week. We hope that you are excited to see it and to get involved with this kit. And I hope that I have answered some of the questions you may have had about working in this way. If you've got any further ones that I haven't answered and you want to pop them in our direct messages, I will be checking those again later on, so do feel free to pop me a message. Otherwise, it's been lovely having you on and I've really enjoyed chatting with you today. I look forward to seeing you in the next stitch along. This stitch along will be made available to watch later should you want to recap on anything, or if you are watching this later, then thank you for checking in. I'm grateful in the past for you. All right. Have fun, stay safe and keep making beautiful things. Bye for now.